We are going to move into our next panel. I am just going to introduce them, their names, and I know once they get started, they will give you a full background on who they are. I'm going to ask them each to turn on their video so that they can be a part of this upcoming panel entitled Gender-Based Violence in Schools. So we have moderating this wonderful panel, Dr. Brittany Brinkman, who is also a member of our Black Girls Equity Alliance and convener of the Health and Wellness Working Group. We have Sue Fritchie, Cheryl Kleiman, Shawali Patel, Ashley Sawyer, and Dr. Liz Miller. Thank you for being here. Brittany, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Kathy. Good morning, everybody. It's really great to be here with you all. This morning has been so dynamic and interesting already, and I know I've learned a lot. I think everyone has. So what we're going to be doing with this panel, shifting gears a little bit and talking specifically about gender-based violence within school settings, and some of the dynamics about how that manifests and what's going on in schools. And we know that it contributes to this push-pull dynamic we've been talking about the last 2 days for girls as they get pushed out of school-based settings, that might be one of the factors that contributes to their vulnerability to being trafficked. So this is a topic that the Black Girls Equity Alliance has been working on for a number of years. We've done advocacy within local school districts to really address the ways that they are or are not working on gender-based violence, particularly looking at sexual harassment. We did a research study as a group looking at Black girls' experiences of sexual harassment locally. Some of that data is in the process of being published, so hopefully that will be out soon to share with everybody. So I'm really excited to get to welcome our great panelists this morning. We have some local and national experts who are going to talk to us about gender-based violence in schools. So we're going to dive in. Since Kathy did quick introductions, I think we will jump into some of the content here. So the first part, we're going to talk a little bit about Title IX, and Sue Fritchie is going to talk a little bit about some of the basics about Title IX and how it impacts LGBT students in particular. And then Shawali Patel is going to share a little bit about some of the changes that are happening in Title IX that are pretty concerning in their impact and what their organization is doing about that. So Sue, I'll pass it over to you.
All right, can you hear me, I hope, and see me? Okay, good. All right, well, that's a good morning. So I'm so happy to be here. This is one of the most exciting events of the year. And even when it's all virtual, it still packs a punch, you know? So I'm just so thrilled to be among this amazing group of advocates and women and men working to solve our problems. So I'm going to just start off with a quick overview of Title IX, which is arguably the most powerful, or at least has the potential to be the most powerful and is certainly the most well-known law protecting us from all kinds of sex discrimination in educational settings. So I work at the Women's Law Project. We're a nonprofit women's legal advocacy organization in Pittsburgh, and I represent students and employees who are being sexually harassed and whose school or workplace is not responding in a way that makes it possible for them to succeed at their education or their job. Title IX is a great tool for combating sexual harassment in the education settings, but it goes way beyond sexual harassment. It prohibits all kinds of different types of sex discrimination, and it covers broadly just about any school that receives even a penny of federal funding, which is most schools. So it applies to kindergarten, it applies to elementary school, to junior and middle schools and senior highs, colleges, universities, postgraduate programs. It applies through the entire lifespan of a student's educational journey. And it prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex. It says no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Now, that was enacted back in 1972, and right away, it ushered in pretty revolutionary changes in women's and girls' college and high school sports, getting us somewhat closer to equality, though we still really do have a long way to go for female athletes to be treated equally or have an equal share of athletic opportunities and scholarships. Title IX protects pregnant and parenting students from getting pushed out of school. It prevents schools from denying educational opportunities to students because of sex. So female students can't be categorically banned from taking calculus, for example, or shop class, as was the case when I was in school. What we're going to focus on today, though, is the application of Title IX to sexual harassment. So sexual harassment is unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature that is severe or pervasive and adversely affects a student's education, or creates a hostile or abusive educational environment. So some examples would be unwelcome sexual advances, unwanted requests for someone to go out with you, unwanted verbal or nonverbal or physical conduct. So it spans this whole continuum of conduct, and can include things like sexist jokes, comments about people's bodies, unwanted pressure to have sex, up to and including, the most extreme sexual assault. It includes harassment aimed at someone's pregnancy. It doesn't have to involve any kind of sexual desire at all on the part of the harasser. You can have sexual harassment where the harasser is making fun of a girl for excelling in trigonometry, or because she isn't feminine enough, or she isn't conforming to some gender stereotype. All of those things can be components of sexual harassment. So the reason that this is considered sex discrimination is because it's very effective at interfering with someone's educational participation. And if schools don't effectively and promptly move to stop the harassment, prevent it from recurring, and remedy its terrible effects on the harassed student, it can completely sabotage a student's chance to succeed in school. It is really common for sexual harassment to be accompanied by racial harassment, harassment based on disability, harassment based on sexual orientation or gender identity. That is very, very common. And our courts are especially bad at dealing with that kind of intersectional discrimination. So instead of looking especially hard and searchingly in cases where the harasser is targeting more than one characteristic that is supposed to be protected by the law, our legal system kind of makes you prove your case piecemeal, which is difficult to do sometimes. And that is certainly not the way victims of harassment experience their oppression. You probably already know, and it is indeed a theme of these presentations, that schools can echo some of the same biases and stereotypes of the harassers and magnify the harassment, and that happens with greater force and frequency to girls of color, to students with disabilities, and to LGBTQ students. We see retaliation occurring in almost every case of this nature that comes to the Women's Law Project. The reason they come to us is often not because of the actual harassment, but because of the way the school has responded to it. And Black girls are often just stereotyped as, well, that wouldn't have happened to you if you weren't promiscuous. You're so angry, you're being too aggressive. All of those really vicious racist stereotypes. Or students with disabilities having their complaints ignored because they are simply across the board ignored. Or LGBT students who report harassment getting labeled as attention seeking, another stereotype, right? So retaliation occurs in many, many cases. Dr. Brittany, in fact, found, I think, if I got the number right, you can correct me if I'm wrong, as much as 20% of the students that you surveyed said they got in trouble at school for reporting sexual harassment. And that can sometimes be worse and more damaging to a student emotionally and to their educational progress than the actual original harassment. So it is not surprising this is underreported. Are LGBTQ students protected from discrimination under Title IX? Sure, there is no kind of carve out for those students. They too are protected from sex discrimination. However, this is an area where the law is seesawing back and forth. One of the Trump administration's first actions after taking office was to take away an Obama administration guidance that interpreted Title IX to prohibit discrimination against transgender students. So that was an actual explicit attack on protections under the law, under Title IX for transgender students. But in addition to that, the Trump administration has just eviscerated its enforcement. A study found that if you look at complaints filed by LGBTQ students under the Trump administration, they were 9 times less likely to result in any corrective action than they had been under the Obama administration. The good news is this, just a couple of months ago in June, the US Supreme Court, which had not yet then lost its most wonderful Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, ruled in a case called Bostock versus Clayton County, Georgia, that a similar federal anti-discrimination law that applies in workplace discrimination should be interpreted to apply to sexual orientation and gender identity or expression as a form of sex discrimination. It is highly probable that that's going to change the law as it relates to sex discrimination in schools so that LGBT harassment will be counted as a prohibited form of sexual harassment. Already courts are headed in that direction, and that is enormously good news. The bad news is the court has opened the door to broader religious exceptions to non-discrimination. I can say more about that later, but at this point, I would like to turn it over to Shawali, who can talk to you about some more bad news and what they're doing about it.
Thank you, Sue, for that really important overview and kind of, setting, the foundation, laying out what Title IX is and how critical it is to protecting students and also educators from discrimination based on sex. So good morning, everyone. I'm Shawali Patel. I'm with the National Women's Law Center. I'm our Director of Justice for Student Survivors, and my work focuses on Title IX and advocating for student survivors of sexual harassment and other forms of sex-based harassment in K-12 as well as higher ed. The National Women's Law Center was founded in 1972, which is when Title IX went into law. And since then, we have been advocating for the rights of women and girls in education, in the workplace, in healthcare. We also work on income security and childcare issues through federal and state policy advocacy, as well as litigation. including litigation against the administration, which I'll talk about. Since my focus for today's panel is on the harmful kind of changes and the attacks on survivors from the Trump administration. So as Sue explained, Title IX is a critical law that protects students from all forms of sex discrimination, which includes sexual harassment. And that's because of the recognition that sexual harassment can have a significant impact on a student's ability to feel safe at school and to be able to learn. And that often, as we all know, through the cases that we work on and the survivors that we work with, that sexual harassment can lead to school push out, where students are actually pushed out of school and unable to complete their education or are dealing with other challenges in completing their education because they've experienced sexual harassment, which includes sexual assault. And also, as Sue mentioned, right now we are in a very important and historic moment for Title IX, which unfortunately has been triggered by politics. But you know, I will give you some hope, you know, during my presentation, and that there are still things that schools can do to ensure that students are protected if they've been sexually harassed. So to give some background, kind of going back to the start of this administration, in 2017, Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos rescinded key guidance that was issued in 2011 and 2014, which outlined what schools must do to respond to sexual harassment under Title IX. And this was guidance that was created after a lot of advocacy by students and student survivors and advocates demanding that the federal government do something about how schools have been responding so poorly and terribly to sexual harassment. And this was critical guidance. And what DeVos did was rescind it in 2017 September, and instead issued this confusing and harmful interim guidance that removed protections for students, and also announced then that the Department of Education was going to engage in rulemaking, meaning that they were actually going to change their Title IX laws around sexual harassment. Just weeks before doing that, Secretary DeVos made statements that diminished the full range of sexual harassment impacting students. She said something like, if everything is harassment, then nothing is. And another official who oversaw the department's civil rights office at the time, Candace Jackson, reinforced amid the false accusations to the New York Times. She has said that about 90% of her office's Title IX investigation were the result of, quote, drunken sexual encounters and regret. So this really shows how the administration was approaching the issue of sexual harassment that was really coming from a place of doubting survivors. So I think that really kind of lays the framework of the changes that we saw. And then about a year later in 2018, they proposed changes to Title IX, significantly weakening civil rights protections for survivors. There were almost 125,000 public comments, including from advocacy organizations, students, from families of students, from civil rights organizations, schools, professors, teachers, mental health professionals, the majority opposing this rule. And yet the department continued with it, and they finalized the rule earlier this year, May 2020, in the middle of this global pandemic, retaining many of the harmful provisions, which I'm about to discuss, and adding some new ones. And the rule went into effect on August 14, 2020. So for those of you who are in school, or you have family members in school, or work with schools, you may have heard about, hopefully your school says something about the Title IX changes and what it meant for the school's policies, because they did go into effect a month ago. Under the new rule, it will be much harder to get helpful supportive measures or fair investigation, or in some instances, any investigation at all. This is because the rule would require schools to ignore a lot of reports of Title IX sexual harassment by narrowing what can be investigated. And when schools are able to investigate claims under their Title IX policies, it would mandate unfair procedures that thousands of students and advocates and legal experts strongly feel are unfair to complainants and survivors. These are procedures that we know will chill reporting of sexual harassment, which is already so underreported. And in fact, the department explicitly stated in the rule that it is seeking a reduction in the number of Title IX investigations that schools undertake, which really just takes a civil rights law and turns it on its head by ensuring that schools do less rather than more to respond to sexual harassment. So the types of complaints that schools would now, I guess Title IX complaints that they would now have to ignore is when a student is complaining about sexual harassment that occurs outside of an education program or activity. So a lot of off-campus sexual assault or harassment that occurs at private parties, and harassment that doesn't meet this narrow definition that they now created. And if a complainant, so the survivor has already graduated, or let's say they dropped out of the school because of what they experienced, their complaint would now have to be dismissed. It would also give schools permission to, while not requiring, it would give them permission to dismiss complaints when the respondent, so the student that was accused, or the professor or the teacher, is no longer at the school. And in higher education, so in colleges and universities, schools would be allowed to ignore all sexual harassment that's not reported to a small subset of high-ranking school employees. So that means if a student is reporting to their coach or their professor that they've been sexually assaulted by another professor or by a student, hoping that they'll do something about it. If that employee ignores it, the school is off the hook. And once they are required to investigate, the schools would have to use procedures that treat survivors unfairly, making it harder for them to come forward. Schools would be required to start an investigation with the presumption that there's no sexual harassment, effectively presuming that students who come to report are lying. It would require, in some cases, schools to use a more demanding standard of proof, so making it harder to prove sexual harassment than the standard that would be used to prove other types of student misconduct. And in higher education, so again, in colleges and universities, students and their witnesses would have to submit to direct live cross-examination that would be done orally and in real time by the other party's advisor of choice. So imagine a student survivor being questioned by the attackers or the respondent's angry parent or fraternity brother. And we know, again, that sexual harassment is already so underreported, and having a process like this that could be re-traumatizing would deter many students from participating in investigations at all. And Sue also mentioned religious exemptions. This is pretty key under Title IX. There are exemptions, meaning that some schools are allowed to not comply with certain provisions of Title IX. They're allowed to discriminate, essentially, if they're a religious institution and they can show that complying with certain parts of Title IX, not all of it, would conflict with their religious tenets. And what the department has done, as recently as even a few days ago, is just kind of made it easier and easier for those schools to claim an exemption, which we know will particularly harm LGBTQ students when schools claim that they want to be able to discriminate based on sexual orientation or gender identity. It will harm students who are pregnant or parenting, or who make decisions based on their health, like deciding to get an abortion. So we are very concerned about that significant widening of religious exemptions. And ultimately, these changes as a whole, we know will make it harder to report sexual harassment, and it just relies on and perpetuates this false and toxic stereotype that survivors, especially women and girls, but all survivors, this myth that they tend to lie about sexual assault and harassment, and therefore need to be subjected to more scrutiny than anyone reporting any other type of misconduct. And because of how harmful this rule is, by removing protections for survivors and really turning Title IX on its head, it's being challenged in 4 separate lawsuits that are pending, including one from National Women's Law Center, and there's a separate lawsuit that Girls for Gender Equity, where Ashley Sawyer, one of our co-panel presenters, works at. that. And then another 2 lawsuits filed by a coalition of states and the District of Columbia. So in summary, the rule is dangerous and cruel, but the good news is that there's still some things that schools can do to protect students despite this terrible rule, because in some instances, schools do have a choice between policies that are more harmful or less harmful to survivors, and they can still be in compliance with the Title IX rule. So they can do this by creating a sexual misconduct policy separate from Title IX to protect a broader base of survivors. So the new rule explicitly states that schools are allowed to create their own separate sexual misconduct policies that are not tied to Title IX. Now, is this confusing? Yes. Does this mean that all schools are going to do the right thing and, create those additional policies? No, but this is an opportunity to advocate with schools that they do that, because these separate policies can still dictate what kind of complaints schools must respond to. So, for example, under the new rule, schools would be required, as I said earlier, to dismiss many Title IX complaints of off-campus harassment or harassment that's not considered severe enough. But schools could still respond to those types of complaints under a separate process that they have to essentially call a non-Title IX policy. It still means that, if a school messes up and, is doing something harmful in these non-Title IX policies, that unfortunately the student would not be able to turn to the federal government to file a separate complaint claiming that their Title IX rights were violated. But there is still an opportunity for students and advocates to urge their institutions to have these separate policies and to respond to all forms of sexual harassment, even if the Title IX rule does not allow it. It also means that students can ask their schools to have a separate policy that is more equitable, that doesn't require something as harmful as direct live cross-examination when they're responding to non-Title IX sexual harassment. And the department has also stated that schools can use this separate process to address incidents that happened before August 14, 2020. So that if someone was assaulted during a study abroad program in February of this year, for example, the school can still choose to investigate their case, even though that's not covered by the new rule. Now, I know I said a lot of information and there's much more to say about this that I don't have time to go over, but I will provide my contact information in the chat box for anyone who wants to follow up. We have resources. We can connect you with other organizations that work with students to advocate around these changes. And then lastly, what I wanted to quickly go over, and I know we have a whole bunch of other great speakers, so I don't want to take up too much more time, but there are other things that schools can still do to protect survivors outside of the grievance process that could help with prevention of sexual harassment and supporting students. So this includes providing comprehensive sex education that is LGBTQI affirming, medically accurate, and covers issues like consent and dating violence. We know that sex education is one of the most effective tools in preventing sexual harassment, and so it's critical that schools have comprehensive sex education. Schools should also train all staff on sexual harassment and how to recognize it and to understand their obligations under school policies and Title IX, including who the Title IX coordinator is. I am just constantly surprised, I guess not surprised anymore, but really disheartened when, we litigate cases on behalf of students who've been assaulted in high school and their schools pushed them out of school because they punished them or didn't believe them. And it's just incredible how much we learn through depositions and through questioning of the schools, how staff don't even understand what their policies are. They don't even know who the Title IX coordinator is. And that could make such a big difference if they receive that information and education. Schools should also collect climate surveys, which are an important tool for understanding whether students feel supported and safe in their school community, which could include questions about prevalence and then survey their attitudes about sexual harassment. Schools should also not punish survivors. They should support them, especially for conduct that results from the harassment. It's unfortunately not uncommon for students who've experienced harassment to, because of the trauma that they've experienced and the lack of the support from their school, to be unable to focus in class or maybe drop out of class temporarily. Maybe they don't want to be in the same class as their perpetrator. Their grades have suffered. And instead of punishing them for this, schools should try to address, their needs and the type of supportive measures they need to be able to continue learning in a safe environment, whether it's providing academic accommodations like extensions on exams, changing classrooms, or providing access to counseling. And so I will kind of leave it at that for now. We do have resources at the National Women's Law Center. We have a legal network for gender equity. I'll drop a link in the chat box. For anyone who is looking for legal assistance, we can connect you to attorneys across the country. And thank you so much. And I believe Ashley Sawyer from Girls for Gender Equity is next.
Yeah, I'm gonna actually jump in because we have a question, but thank you so much, Sue and Shwali, for this like overview of Title IX. As you both said, there's so much more to it, and really for all the work you're both doing and your organizations are doing to protect Title IX and protect our girls in school. I think it's really important for people to hear, right, that these changes happened this summer. So both schools and universities were doing their best to figure out how to teach during a pandemic, and then on top of that are being tasked with rewriting policies and potentially adding additional policies outside of the official Title IX policy to protect students. So I know for some people, you know, this has sort of fallen off their radar, but it's really crucial that we stay on top of what schools and universities are doing. There is a question in the chat box, so I want to put that out there, and then we'll jump over to Ashley and hear what Girls for Gender Equity has been doing. So the question in the chat box was, I think, particularly about the changes, the recent changes to Title IX. This is effectively the opposite of how Title IX has been applied in the past. Is that correct? Particularly in terms of preponderance of evidence and who is considered a responsible employee.
Sorry, yes, I was adding something in the chat box as well, but yes. So in terms of preponderance of the evidence, which essentially is a standard of evidence that puts both parties at an equal place, right? It's the most equitable standard of evidence. It's a standard that's used in civil rights cases in court. So if someone is actually filing a Title IX lawsuit or one under another civil rights law, or a bunch of other laws, the court is also using preponderance of the evidence. And that's what's been the department's policies for years. But what the department has done in the Title IX rule is saying that it's said that schools can use clear and convincing evidence, which is higher. It makes it harder for a student survivor to essentially prove or show what happened to them, meets their definition of sexual harassment. It also, because it would require that schools use the same standard of evidence that they use for faculty grievance procedures for sexual harassment. And we know a lot of schools, because of their collective bargaining agreements, already require a higher standard of evidence for misconduct involving faculty or school employees. And so this would essentially force a lot of schools into then using the higher standard for their students. It also has changed significantly the definition of responsible employee. So this is the individual who, when they find out about sexual harassment or assault, they have an obligation to do something with the report. They can't just ignore it. Otherwise, the school would be on the hook for violating Title IX. So for higher education in colleges and universities, they're limiting the responsible employee to a Title IX coordinator or to an individual with authority to institute corrective measures. So someone who's pretty high up in the school who often does not have a relationship with students. So that means if a student is now reporting to their coach, or let's say their athletic director, that they've been harassed or assaulted, or maybe the coach or athletic director or professor knows about this like harassment that's happening, and they just ignore it, they look the other way, it's now okay. It means, the school ignored it, maybe the student was pushed out of school as a result, they weren't able to participate in their team as a result, they're no longer held liable, whereas under the previous guidance, they would have been.
Thank you. So we might have more questions about this. If you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat box or the Q&A. I do want to turn over to Ashley Sawyer from Girls for Gender Equity. I know you all have been working in this space for years, and especially with Black girls and other girls of color. So we're really excited to have you here to talk to us about how you all have centered youth voices in this work around gender-based harassment and sexual harassment, and what you feel like is important for us to keep on our radar right now.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm glad that I am able to be a part of this conversation, even virtually. As you can see in the little box, my name is Ashley. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm the Senior Director of Campaigns at Girls for Gender Equity, and we're based in Brooklyn, New York, but we do city, state, and national work. Our work really began through an understanding of the ways that Black girls experience sexual violence in their schools and in their communities and in their homes. Our founder and president, Joanne Smith, started GGE as what was supposed to be a short fellowship focused on increasing girls' access to athletic programs in Central Brooklyn. She had been a college athlete herself and wanted to make sure that girls of color in Central Brooklyn had access to sports. And in the very first year that Girls for Gender Equity was founded, an 8-year-old Black girl was sexually assaulted on her way to school in Brooklyn. And so that shifted the trajectory of our organization and really laid the foundation for our commitment to making sure that Black girls are safe, healed, and affirmed in their communities, in their homes. But one of the things that Joanne often shares when she tells that story is that the girl, after being sexually assaulted on her way to school, went to the arms of her principal, and the principal of that school really didn't know what to do or how to respond. And so it opens the conversation about the ways that our communities, our schools, our families are all connected in this. We all need to be connected in our commitment to protecting young people. And there are steps that each of us can be taking, whether in communities, in homes, in schools. And so over the years, your question was sort of about like, how do we bring young folks into that conversation? Joanne wrote a book called Hey Shorty, which folks can find about street harassment. But then I want to say maybe 3 or 4 years ago, we launched a participatory action research process. We call it a PAR process for short, where 100 young folks from New York City public schools were able to talk to each other and have conversation and do a research process about what was coming up for them in school and what were the barriers to achieving their educational goals and to experiencing safety and wholeness in the educational setting. And a number of things came up. One of the things that young folks said was a real barrier for them was school-based sexual harassment. Often young folks didn't always have the language for it and didn't really understand what constitutes school-based sexual harassment, because there are games that are very common that many of us knew from when we were growing up, like booty tag, where young people, run around and grab each other's bodies, and that is often taught as acceptable and permissible in a school setting, and even in some schools like a rite of passage. Young people playing booty tag on the playground. When we bring a conversation or really about race into this, what we see is that when Black girls experience school-based sexual violence, they are more likely to be punished and they're more likely to be suspended or expelled. So in some schools, they have policy that say any type of sexual activity on campus is not allowed. And so what that means is if a student comes forward and says that they've experienced school-based sexual harassment, whether someone grabbing their behind in a game of booty tag or popping their bra strap or saying sexually suggestive things to them, the young person has to worry about, am I going to be in trouble because is this behavior going to be considered engaging in sexual activity on campus or at the school environment? Another thing that we see happen often is that Black girls might push back, might slap the person who grabbed them, might punch them and say, this is not acceptable, please don't touch me like that, or yell at them, curse at the person, whatever the case may be. And then that student is the student who pushed back is a student who gets suspended or expelled. And so that's an issue across New York State in particular, and across the country really. And what we know is, I know yesterday I got to hear Centoya Brown-Long talk about her experiences with schools and the ways that her school really pushed her into the harmful situations that she's experienced and the way that they, wanted to get rid of her. And we see that happening with Black girls all over the country. When a Black girl says, something's not acceptable, I don't like this, or this doesn't feel good to me, they are more likely to be viewed as being too grown, or Centoya talked about that framing of being fast. That's a stereotype that's often put onto Black girls. We, heard about the research from Georgetown about the adultification of Black girls yesterday. And I was really glad that we lifted that research up, because when historically in our country, when white women have come forward and said that they've been harmed and experience sexual violence, they're more likely to be believed, but Black women are considered too strong. Like, no one could have harmed you because you're strong and you're, an angry Black woman and you have so much strength. And so how could you be perceived as a person in need of care and protection? And so at GGE, we make a point to do our work on behalf of girls of color, but we have no problem unapologetically naming that we want to center Black girls. We center Black girls in our national political agenda, and we center Black girls in the work that we do. We obviously run healing and support programs. I don't do that work. I really feel blessed to work alongside colleagues who are trained social workers and really skilled at creating healing spaces for young folks. But we run the Me Too Movement's youth programming called Sisters in Strength, and it's a place for young folks who experience gender-based violence to heal and build their advocacy skills and do really critical work for their own healing and their own processes. And so I want to, really lift up the work that's happening at Sisters in Strength and say that so much of the things that I think all of us are working on are really trying to be survivor-centered. And so what that means for us is that we want to make sure that there are resources being poured into prevention. That's really crucial. I'm so glad, Shawali, that you mentioned the importance of comprehensive sexual health education. We are not going to do anything as a movement to address school-based sexual violence if we do not have comprehensive sex ed at every level. The research is there. You're not going to play a game of whack-a-mole out of this problem. You're not going to catch every person who's done harm, because at the end of the day, so many of the young people that we know, and this is sort of coming from my experience as an attorney, most of the young people, particularly at the elementary and middle school age, don't actually understand which behavior constitutes sexual harassment or is considered inappropriate. And we know in the political climate that we live in, people in high-ranking roles have been accused or blatantly admit to engaging in sexual harassment. And so we can't expect children to know what behavior is acceptable or not acceptable when there are very powerful people in our country who engage in sexual harassment all the time with impunity. So comprehensive sex ed really gives us an opportunity to teach young people about consent, affirmative consent, building healthy relationships, and really understanding what does it mean to create a positive school climate. And when we talk about positive school climate, we also mean a school climate that is healing and affirmative for queer and trans students, and healing and affirmative and safe for girls and young people across the gender spectrum to, go to school without fear of violence of any kind. One of the things that we're also really trying to bring to everyone's awareness is the prevalence of school-based sexual harassment at the hands of school police. We believe that policing is inherently violent, and school police are a part of a system of oppression. And we think of school policing as an example of state violence, right? Girls of color experience sexual violence often at the hands of school cops who have a great deal of power. If a young person were to say that the school cop, school safety agent, school resource officer were to have harmed her, we know who will be believed. We know that she doesn't have a lot of agency or a lot of power. And we also know that schools are always telling us they don't have enough resources to teach young folks about consent. They don't have enough resources to bring in experts to create positive school climate. And we have to all ask ourselves, why don't schools have enough resources to build positive school climate? And I can tell you, in my mind, one of the main reasons that we don't have the resources is because our cities, our states, our school districts have poured millions of dollars into policing, work to control and surveil young folks. And in New York, we just had a huge budget fight in the late spring, early summer, where GGE, we launched a campaign to remove school safety agents from our schools, to institute a hiring freeze because there was a hiring freeze for teachers, but not for school cops. And to say that the $351 million, you heard me correctly, $351 million per year that New York City spent on school cops could go toward providing the healing and affirmative mental health supports that young folks needed, particularly as they are living through a pandemic, something that none of us have ever experienced. I don't think any of us thought that we would be doing this conference through our computers, right? And imagine having to be in school every single day and living like that. And then for so many Black and Latinx young folks whose parents are essential workers, they've lost loved ones. They have lost loved ones, friends, neighbors have died. Their families are dealing with so much economic uncertainty, so on and so forth. And so we're like, how can we expect young people to show up and create positive school climate when we haven't invested the resources? And so there's a connection there between the presence of school police and the over-reliance of criminalization as a way to address sexual violence. and the prevalent school-based sexual harassment that we see all the time in our schools and in our communities. And so at GGE, we're just consistently lifting up a couple of key things. One, we need to make space for healing and support for young folks, and that's not going to happen if there aren't resources. Two, we have to make a commitment to prevention. Our goal is not to try to play a game where we're always trying to fix things that are broken. What we want to be doing is prevent them from getting broken in the first place. We want to prevent a young person from ever being subjected to a game of booty tag and having to figure out, am I going to push this person or fight back and get suspended and lose out on education? Or am I going to allow this to happen and feel so harmed in my educational setting? Like, young people should never experience that. And the third point that I really want to make is that we need to broaden our understanding of who's doing harm in schools. So much of the emphasis of the conversation around school-based sexual violence really focuses on peer-to-peer, which is certainly an issue, but really that's an issue of adults failing to do what we were supposed to do, which is educate young folks and build communities of consent. And the adult to student sexual violence often happens at the hands of people who have a lot of power, and we can't imagine. I would never, bring a school cop. We wouldn't bring a school cop into our homes to police our children. So why is that allowed, particularly in communities of color? We see that overwhelmingly, predominantly white school districts do not have a large school-based police force in the ways that we see in Black and Latinx communities. And then I also want to name the ways that Black girls are sexualized, which creates an environment or a context where this behavior is considered permissible. And I'll close because I'm really excited to hear what my former colleague Cheryl has to say. But one of the incidents that sort of still boils my blood as I think about Binghamton, New York. It's a little bit far from New York City, but 4 girls of color, Black girls were strip searched at their school by a school nurse and an assistant principal because they were giggling too much. And so when we talk about this conversation about Black girls being adultified or girls of color being seen as harmful in a school space, Black people, I can't stop thinking about Breonna Taylor and so many other Black women who've been killed, but also even at our infancy, even when we're children, Black girls don't even get to have levity and joy. Like, I think a middle school young person gets to laugh and giggle and maybe be giggling out of turn, right? Like, when we divorce ourselves from this understanding that we are supposed to control young people in school and you're supposed to laugh when you're allowed to laugh and not laugh when it's not recess, like, that is harmful, and that's sexual violence, right? To tell a young person that you don't even have autonomy over your body. And the assistant principal and the nurse in that situation said that they believe that these girls couldn't be giggling like that unless they were on drugs. And so we need to have a conversation around, sort of that war on drugs mentality, the zero tolerance policies. But those young people are going to have a very painful relationship with education when we know that at school, a place where they are expected to be safe, they are told to disrobe. And if you don't, the one student who did not disrobe was a student who got suspended for not adhering to an adult telling them to take their clothes off. And so we all need to really understand our relationship to wanting to control young people's bodies and bodily autonomy for children. It's okay for a young person to say, no, I'm not taking off my clothes for you. And this is my body and I have autonomy over it. And we can't have that conversation without having a nuanced conversation about race and the ways that from the very beginning of this country, Black bodies were seen as property. And that still manifests in the way that we teach and the way that we interact with Black girls. And so I'm just really excited that this conversation is happening, and I want to continue to push us to think about more that we can be doing to create safety and healing for our young folks. So excited to hear from Cheryl.
Thanks, Ashley. I think this is a perfect transition. You spoke so well to all the integration of these issues. And I think that's part of what, we were trying to do with the Black Girls Equity Alliance. And, it stood out to me that our research project about sexual harassment started with a focus group with Black girls about police and schools. And it led to them talking about sexual harassment, right? So perfect transition, I think, into Cheryl talking about some of the work we're doing locally.
I know we are short on time, but I just want to take a moment to pause and take in all of the brilliance that Ashley just shared with us. She's such, I'm so honored to be in this space with you, and you are such a teacher to me. So with the time remaining and with so much of this already covered, I just want to briefly say so a little bit about the role of lawyers in this work. I'm a civil rights attorney with the Education Law Center. We're a nonprofit law firm that represents students and parents in public education in Pennsylvania. And we represent individual students and families, but at the heart of what we do is really understanding how the individual experience is part of a collective, and how schools and systems and institutions work together too often to criminalize Black girls and students that are responding appropriately to the unjust systems that they find themselves in. And so when we do this work, we're really trying to look at what are the levers we can push and pull to change systems and understand how they work together. And we do that by listening to the students and families and communities who have that lived experience, and trying to use the law to help accomplish what they say it is that they want and need. And so I just want to highlight some of the themes you've already heard and connect this to the work that Dr. Monique Morris is doing. We have had the tremendous privilege in Pittsburgh. I know many of us have heard her when she brought her book to Pittsburgh in 2016, and the film screening she brought to this summit a year ago this week. That we don't, what we have all been talking about is the culture of push out. We do not need formal discipline and interactions with law enforcement to create schools where Black girls know that they are not safe, that they are not affirmed, that they are not thriving. And yet we still then have the discipline and the referrals to law enforcement, including in Allegheny County. Many of us were involved in the Black Girls Equity Alliance Juvenile Justice Report that was released last week. So I want to make that connection because, and echo what so many of my co-panelists have said, which is that we as lawyers often try to do this work to address the harm after it's been done. But so many of us are thinking about how do we move upstream, and how do we support movements for Black girls? How do we as lawyers be tacticians to try to create positive school climates? Because we know so much of what it means for Black girls to be safe and thriving in school is about relationships. And we cannot build positive relationships by relying on the systems that oppress Black girls and expect them to heal them. So I have been in so many situations where I'm representing a child who's being disciplined after the school failed to address the sexual harassment, and the same adult that she was told, this is your trusted adult that is supposed to be the person you go to, is the person that is then sitting opposite her at the table and testifying in support of her discipline. And so when we realize that the person that they are supposed to go to is the one that can control whether or not they are allowed to stay in school or has the power to arrest them, we need to create different pathways of support and accountability that allow Black girls to be safe, affirmed, and stay in school. And so I'm so grateful to do this work with others, and as we are thinking about how we as lawyers need to recognize that too often what we have seen as legal wins have not created transformational change for the lives of Black girls, and that we need to use the tools that we have to support the Black women that are supporting Black girls and have been doing and leading this work for centuries. So thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. Liz, I'd like to open up to you and just, I know you're such an important voice in this space locally and nationally, and so yeah, where would you like to go? There's so much.
Oh my goodness, right? I just have to say, what an incredible privilege to be in this space with the incredibly powerful voices who I think have actually hit on every point that I would want to make about gender-based violence in schools, right? Policy matters, law matters, but practice matters also. And this to me, hearing this is exactly the kind of hope that I needed when 2 days ago, not only was there a ridiculous executive order about all anti-racism training stopping if you've got federal funding, to the horrific lack of justice for Breonna Taylor. It's been a really rough 48 hours. And to come together like this and saying, oh, no, we can do this together is incredibly powerful. That we can center young people's voices, absolutely. And as so beautifully put in the chat, right, the systems that continue to oppress our Black girls cannot heal them. That is really what we need to be doing, is thinking about the structural inequities that persist. So I will just pick up and say that for me, the privilege of working with the Black Girls Equity Alliance, and in particular with the Health and Wellness Group, has been an understanding that comprehensive sexual health education has to include an intersectional perspective, an anti-racist perspective, that inclusion is not merely we're all about diverse voices, but that every child feels like they belong in the school environment. And that means being very assiduous about not letting trauma-informed schools and that whole framework becoming co-opted by white supremacy, right? So we continue to have to talk about misogyny and sexism and all of the ways in which systemic racism operates, and the ways in which transgender and gender diverse students continue to be marginalized and minoritized, that it is absolutely vital for us to hold onto in every space that we continue to talk about love and relationships and belonging, whether it's in trauma-informed care, whether it's in bullying prevention, which is the way in which so much of sexual harassment is whitewashed, right? So that it is not a Title IX issue. And the ways in which we talk to young people about the beauty of their bodies, their right to safe and pleasurable and consensual relationships is really the crux of this. And so, at the end of the day, here locally in Pittsburgh, I feel so much hope that we can do the grassroots work, get the cops out of schools, and really start to think about what safe, supportive, and inclusive community looks like for all of our children.
Thank you, Liz. So I'm watching our time here. I do want to let people know that obviously this conversation needs to continue. Some elements of this will continue today. We have meetings with the working groups. The Health and Wellness Group will be talking about some of these topics. We'll be talking about the local work around police and schools. So I encourage you to stay engaged there and to follow up with any of our speakers and to follow the amazing work that they're doing. And then just if there's any last words, if anybody wants to close out with something you want to leave the audience with, an action or a hope. I like that. Liz, I'm with you. Like it's been, there's not been a lot of hope the last, I don't know, 4 years. But if there's any last words, yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Like I said, please stay in conversation with us. I do think that the way we're going to make change happen is together and building coalitions across disciplines so that we are really addressing all of these systems that have been designed to marginalize Black girls, and that we are really proactively taking an anti-racist stance to do that, regardless of what that executive order says. We're doing it anyway. So stay connected, and I think it's time for a break. Thank you all.
It is. So thank you, everybody. Appreciate you all being a part of this panel, and look forward to having even further discussions around this.